Okay, hello everybody. Nice to see you all again. So this is an idea that I had many years ago, probably at least 10 years ago, when the AC site was in its heyday and we had the Illuminati pub and places like that on Facebook. And the Kabbalion came up, and the seven Hermetic Principles. And right away, I saw that you could explain the seven Hermetic Principles on the basis of mathematics, on the basis of Euler's equation, and in ontological mathematics, Illuminism. And yeah, I was going to write a paper about that, never did that. So why not do a video on it? It came up in one of the comments on my previous video. Someone wanted to know how gender fits into ontological mathematics. The principle of gender, the Hermetic principle of gender, can be explained by ontological mathematics. And so we're going to get that, and we're going to do all of them. So a lot of people probably don't even know, because why would you, what the seven Hermetic principles are. So we'll discuss those a little bit. I mean, not too much in detail. If you want a reference, you can just look up the Kabbalion, and that gives a little bit of info about them. I'll discuss ahead here, what the sort of idea is. But it would be K-Y-B A-L-I-O-N, Kabbalion. All right, so ontological mathematics, the seven Hermetic principles, how ontological mathematics explains why they exist. And of course, thank you to the original Mike Hockney for ontological mathematics. So explain why instead of just assume. So one theme from my recent book, Illuminism, which you should all go have a look at and read, is that with an actual, full, and complete understanding of existence, we can explain why things exist and in the way that they do, instead of having to take them as axioms which are just unexplained. So in science, of course, an example of that is energy. So science doesn't explain what energy is, why it exists. It's just sort of, taken as an axiom, an assumption that, and somehow magically works with mathematics, but it's never really tied together. It's just sort of this thing that's out there, which is assumed and magically works. And they literally say in some papers that it seems to be magic, and not the cool kind of magic, but like the mysterious kind of ridiculous magic that makes no sense, is what they meant. And then of course the quantum mechanical wave equation. So of course this is all in my books. I discuss this in my books and explain why there's a quantum mechanical wave equation in the first place, why it exists in quantum mechanics. Is, in science, it's just like, oh, well, this seems to be what exists. I guess everything is a wave equation. I guess that's how it is, and consciousness seems to affect it, but we have no idea why. Observation seems to affect it. Well, in ontological mathematics, we can explain fundamentally why there should be in the first place such a thing as a wave equation, which describes matter. Why time is different from space. I discuss that in my book. That's a big one in science. Science has no idea why time has the property that it does, why it behaves differently than space, why it manifests differently experientially than space. We can explain that with ontological mathematics, with Euler's equation, as I do in my book, Illuminism. Okay, I'll stop dropping references. But I really want you to go buy it and read it. I think it's my best book yet, Illuminism. Why the speed of light is a constant. Oh man, that's a big... God, think of how much scientists go on about the constancy of the speed of light. God, they just don't frickin' stop about the constancy of the speed of light. They just never end about it. It's like, it gets annoying after a while. It's like, can you explain why the speed of light is a constant in the first place? Explain why it's a constant in the first place. They never approach that. They never go anywhere near that. They're just like, oh my God, the speed of light is a constant, and this is what we can do. I thought, okay, I mean, that's great. That's cool. Yeah, I mean, that's good. That's pragmatic, it's instrumentalist, it's useful, you made a bunch of technology with it. I mean, that's great. It's great, but as a philosopher, we want to understand first principles. Why is that speed a constant in the first place, right? Instead of just taking it as an axiom, as you do, as Einstein does in relativity theory. So, etc. So the seven Hermetic principles, instead of being scientific principles related to matter, they're actually mental principles, right? And so the idea is that ontological mathematics should also, if it's a theory of everything, not only explain the physical principles, as I've been discussing, but also the mental principles. And we can do that. So the seven Hermetic principles. Hermeticism is the original science and is very old, and it's really hard to get a good grasp. There's not much very good literature. You just find bits and pieces all around about it. And it's hard to understand what it means, but it's basically magic And, it's all about how your mind works and how your mind interfaces with reality. I'll discuss more about it later. So here are the seven Hermetic principles: principle of mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender. So let's go through all those and see how we can explain why these should exist. In terms of mathematics, how ontological mathematics explains why these exist in the first place. So what is the principle of mentalism? You will have heard it. Oh, well, here, so in the Kybalion, they say the all is mind, the universe is mental. So it remarks this, but it says that it's undefinable. So in the original, well, in the Kybalion text, whoever wrote that says that the interpretation, though, of this is that, so yes, the all is mind, the universe is mental. However, it's undefinable. They can't define it. However, in ontology, because they're like I think what do you call that? The lunar approach, where it's more about intuition and mental powers. But in ontological mathematics, Illuminism, which is sort of the solar approach, everything is logical and we can explain everything and we have first principles. So we do define mind. We can define it now. What is the base unit of existence? The base unit of existence is the circling, which is and then in sets, of course, as monads, which is a net nothing, which is an abstract conceptual entity which exists as a thought. It is a thought. That's what it is. The circling is Euler's equation, so we can define that. The all mind is number. So now this connects to Pythagoras. We can actually explain the all mind. It's number. It's mathematics. All is number from the Pythagoreans from Pythagoras, right? So that's sort of more like just an initial starting point where ontological mathematics and the Hermetic principles sort of have the same starting point, the principle of mentalism. However, the difference is that in ontological mathematics, we can define it instead of just saying that it's this big unknowable mystery. We can actually define it fully. So let's go to the principle of correspondence. What does this mean? So this is the one that goes as above, so below, as below, so above. So they say that there are planes beyond our knowing, but there's correspondence between them. So, a lot of people, unless you're a scientific materialist, but anyone else would acknowledge that there is such a thing as planes. I mean, the most basic idea would be that there's a heaven, there's this world, and there's hell. That's a very basic idea of different planes of existence, right? Ultimately, the utility of this principle is about comprehending the inner nature of reality, how reality works at the lower level and at the higher level, and how you can manipulate things in order to get results in this world. And that's how you would, sort of perform magic mentally, right? But with ontological mathematics, we can explain why there are different planes. So in my book and in my last video, I showed this diagram of the monad. This is what your monad souls look. And I had one dashed line, and I was saying that lower or the outer region is where humanity and the universe exists, and then if you go inside past this sort of this hermetic seal or transition frequency, which is probably the Planck frequency or something like that, and then you go into the inner mind, right? The Christ within, God within, or whatever. The infinitely powerful God within you. Yeah. Okay. So, but then with this concept is that there's actually multiple planes. So there's correspondence because it's all undergoing the same process of becoming, and so it uses the same methods on all levels. So the idea would be that, say these outer two bands here, for example, these would be maybe a set of, 10 to the power 20 different frequencies, just represented by these two bands. And perhaps this is, say, the plane, like the lower plane of existence, which you would probably call, say, maybe the bacterial plane. So that's the plane of existence that bacteria exists upon, right? Then there's a transition frequency where you go to a higher plane of existence, and this would be the plane where human consciousness exists upon. So relative, between those two planes, relative to the bacterial plane, for example, the human plane is essentially a godlike plane. Like relative to bacteria, we would be, an infinite level of God compared to the freedom that a bacteria has to affect its agency in the world. If you want to think of it that way, a human has almost infinitely more agency compared to bacteria, right? So those are like two different planes of existence. So the point is that we can explain why there should be or could be different planes of existence, and it's related to these sort of different frequency bands which create existence from the monad. Okay, so I think this is probably the weakest one, the one which I'm weakest on, but at least we can show a bit of an idea here of why there would be different planes, and the different plane just means different frequency bands, right? Okay, so the principle of vibration, now obviously this is trivial, obviously. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. Okay, well that's simply the wave equation, which comes from the circling, which is the basis unit of reality, which is Euler's equation. So that's a general form, and that's a sort of simplified general form. So, I mean, for an adept watching this video, somebody who was actually, an actual adept in the Hermetic Principles, I mean, this presentation is probably a little bit naive and silly, but in any case, I'm just showing that you can pretty much see an equivalency between these principles and the mathematical principles, even though it's so simple, right? So everything is vibration. Sure, everything is vibration. A vibration is the circling. That's what the circling is. The circling, which is the base unit of existence, is a vibration, and it's Euler's equation, and this is what it looks like, and this is what it does. It has a cosine component and a sine component. And yeah, that's a vibration. That's what it is. So that's really obvious. Principle of polarity. So everything has two poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. Opposites are the same, differing only in degree. And so this idea is usually presented as, hot versus cold. They're both types of energy, but they have different qualities, right? So love versus hate. They're both, emotions, mental sort of experiences, emotional experiences, but they're opposite, but they're actually both emotion, right? Smart versus dumb, yeah, that's both a quality of thinking. One is poor thinking, one is better thinking, but they're both thinking. I guess that's what the idea is, right? So, but how does this refer to ontological mathematics? So that just refers to different frequencies, but all frequencies are circlings. So of course, a low frequency you would think you would say has less freedom and less thought power and is less intelligent. High frequency is much more freedom and much more intelligent and much more godlike. And so they seem like they're opposite ends of the spectrum, but in fact, they're all just frequencies, right? So I think that works as an explanation for polarity. Oh yeah, the other thing that's kind of neat that you can think of is if you just take the Fourier transform of, say, a single cosine wave, you actually get a pair of poles, which are opposite in nature. What you get a positive frequency pole and a negative frequency pole, which are opposite each other, but they're both poles of frequency. And the reason why there's a negative and positive one actually is because a wave like this cosine could actually be formed by a circling, which is circling clockwise or counterclockwise. And that's why you have two poles. And that goes back to something I brought up in a video a while ago about, I never discussed this in my book, actually. I just left it out because actually I don't know how to answer it quite yet. But that there should be, if a circling can circle in one direction, then it should be able to circle in the other direction too. And is that a real thing? Or, I mean, the Fourier transform says there's a positive and negative frequency, which can explain a single wave, right? Anyway, it's like when you take a square root of a number and you get the plus or minus value, right? Both values are valid, right? And that's how Dirac discovered the anti-electron, for example. Anyway, so that's kind of polarity. I mean, you call these poles. I mean, you would call them poles. They look like poles, right? If you apply the Fourier transform to a frequency, to a vibration, you get positive and negative, which are, opposites, but they're actually describing the same thing, the frequency, the single frequency. Okay, well, anyway, that's neat. The principle of rhythm. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifests and everything. Okay, well, obviously, again, that's really obvious again. It's a corollary of the principle of correspondence and the principle of vibration. It's the sine and cosine wave of the circling. They rise and fall. Obviously, so the wave occurs as the base unit of existence, as the circling. And so you would say that different phases of the wave seem to have different experiential characteristics. So, think of, the climax, everything is awesome, and then you hit rock bottom, and it's awful, and you just sort of It's the same wave. It's one wave you're riding, but this wave has different experiential characteristics. When you're at the bottom of the wave, life is horrible. When you're at the top of the wave, life is awesome. When you're at the middle of the wave, eh. So yeah, it seems to be the wave is experienced differently depending where you are on the wave. And I mean, if the wave is base existence, then you would expect, yeah, then I guess really it just works out that everything follows this sort of wave pattern. You know, they're really just saying the same thing a lot. They're just talking about vibration, the wave, in different ways. You know, and you can tell that they're basically struggling to describe Euler's equation. They're struggling to state Euler's equation, but because they're intuitives, not mathematicians, they can only come up with word descriptions of it, rather than with ontological mathematics, we can just write down exactly what they mean by all this. Well, what they mean by all this is Euler's equation, and this is why they're saying what they're saying, right? Okay, the principle of cause and effect. Again, this becomes really obvious and trivial. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. It's a really basic mathematical statement, of course, isn't it? Since everything is made of circlings, and circlings can only exist rationally as an equation, then all possible interactions of any number of circlings has a mathematically computable result, which means that it follows cause and effect. That means everything will, because everything is a result of circlings, which are math, which therefore, when you add them up together to create different experiences, they all have a computable result, which means that cause and effect is always applying. All of existence is the result of adding up different sets of this equation with variations of the parameters. That's basically all of existence. Adding up a bunch of these equations with variations of frequency and phase and seeing what you get out of it. And that's existence. That is, matter, the earth, your body, atoms, everything added together. Yeah, cool. So the principle of gender. So gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests on all planes. So again, you can easily interpret this as a property of Euler's equation. So feminine would be the cosine and male would be the sine. So feminine, why is feminine the cosine? Because the cosine is symmetric. Symmetry is beauty. And feminine, the woman, is what carries, physical beauty. And you would associate that with being and with space. The sine wave is antisymmetric or asymmetric, and that becomes associated with time, with imaginary numbers, which are associated with time, which means movement, which means becoming, and action, right? So the feminine is the cosine, masculine is the sine wave, and they fit together in Euler's equation. So the feminine nurtures, provides space and elements for growth is a kind of basic idea, and masculine builds, grows, and impresses upon the female in order to grow in, right? Yeah. So that works. Oh yeah, and then here's another thing that's neat. So you already saw this one about, if you take the Fourier transform of a cosine wave, you get an even pair on either side of zero, positive and negative frequency. But if you do that with the sine, you get this odd pair, an asymmetric pair. So you get the negative frequency, but negative amplitude, and then the identical frequency that's positive and positive amplitude, right? So that's kind of neat. Yeah, and so that kind of just shows how that would be, you could consider that to be gender. So this is what so this would be female. It's symmetric, it's even, and that's the basic source of beauty. That's where beauty comes from. Things being the same on either side, a beautiful symmetric face, right? That's basically how beauty manifests in the human form, is symmetry. Whereas, and that's, carried generally by the female, right? Whereas this odd pair, the sine wave, is antisymmetric, and this leads to movement. So this is even, which is, provides the domain of being. This is uneven, which provides or establishes the domain of becoming, or of time and movement, because of this asymmetry. And I explain this in my book, actually. This explains why time as a dimension is different from space as a dimension. All right, so lastly, so what are the Hermetic principles really about? They're really about magic, which means, They're a non-mathematical intuitive perception of the basic equation of existence, the God equation or Euler's formula, and how it manifests reality, and how to mentally work with it. And how to mentally work with it is what you call magic. The Kybalion gives a brief description, but the actual study material and lessons are likely only available in the Invisible College. So you always, I've never actually found anything more in depth than the Kybalion. The Kybalion doesn't actually go that much in depth. It just describes a few things and makes reference to, people are always making reference to the core study material. It's like, okay, well, I've never found it, but you always hear that it's in the Invisible College. And so, yeah, it seems like the Invisible College is a literal college you can go to when you're astral traveling. Out-of-body experiences, a literal college you can go to and study the actual principles of mental magic. Maybe there's some analog in the real world, but they keep themselves very well hidden. So ontological mathematics fulfills turning spiritualism into a science. And at this point, they can likely perform magic via printed circuit boards and simply applying electricity. If you think of your printed circuit board inside your TV, that certainly performs what would be considered magic compared to, say, like a caveman. If a caveman was to see that, he'd be like, wow, that printed circuit board is magical, it makes magic. So it's just, a different level of magic. There's a printed circuit board for, that you can use in warfare. It's like gone beyond 5th generation warfare. It's now like, infinity generation warfare. It's quantum dimensional warfare. You can make a printed circuit board to manifest, a train derailment that, is horrible in an enemy's country that, totally shuts down the enemy, or manifests a bunch of food processing plants to just spontaneously start on fire. You just print a circuit board and you get these magical effects. Maybe it's something like that. Pretty cool science fiction idea. Science fiction fantasy, right? All right. Well, anyway, this was kind of fun, kind of neat. Yeah. So the 7 Hermetic Principles have a foundation in Euler's equation. And I'm sure whoever the people are that are actually working on this, the Pythagorean Illuminati, presumably, yeah, they've probably done some really, really fantastic, amazing things with it. Anyway, I hope you liked that. And if you haven't picked up my book yet, it's under my author name, Joseph E. Postma, on Amazon. And my latest book is Illuminism, Foundation and Lifestyle. And take care, everybody. Good talking to you again. Bye.